blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay, rage, rage against the dying of the light.
If the sea was a creature, what would it be? Well, I could only think of the ancient times where the big octopus would come out of the water and is in control of the sea. I don't know, what would it be? It'd be a fictional animal of the deep in control of the sea. I just don't know. I can't think of something like that. But the sea, you respect. That's what is the most important part of anybody who walks into the water. You've got to respect the sea. It rules you. You cannot tell what it's going to do next. And there's currents around here which will suddenly appear, and the next minute you're taken out to sea. And we do get that now. Most of our calls are for boats or swimmers, the coast guards, the lifeguards, they're all out there. But no, I cannot think what the sea is. The sea itself is a monster. It's got a mind of its own and it will do what it wants and you can't tame it. My name is Sid Wilkins and I've been with the Mumbles Lifeboat for 26 years. I am not crew, but I know all there is to know about the boat and rescue service.
So at the moment you'll probably be aware that the pier is not accessible, so we can't get out to the boathouse to launch the ALB, the all-weather lifeboat. So what we have to do is we have to go out via a boarding boat, and this is the boarding boat. So if the big boat's needed for bigger jobs, essentially the crew will get kitted up here. You'll see the kit over in the corner. They'll come out in the boarding boat and the boarding boat will take us out to the big boat, which is currently moored on a mooring just off the pier, which you might have seen. Then if you come further in, sorry, a bit messy at the moment, we're doing a bit of maintenance, but essentially this is the D-class. The D-class is used for more inshore jobs, so person in water, it can respond very, very quickly. We tend to use it for, you'll notice the lighthouse is an island, a lot of it obviously being quite tidal. So obviously the D-class will be tasked to go and get people that have stuck or the tide have got stuck out due to the tide. A lot of potentially, it's very, very fast response time. So for example, we managed to get it launched from the page of the day within about 6.5 minutes. So really quick, considering all the crew have to come from their homes.
When you get scared and when you get into that storm stage, it's almost like a black hole. It just feels like it's trying to suck you in and suck you away, and it's just so unstable and you just don't know what's going to happen. Rogue waves, high winds. When it gets stormy, it sounds stormy as well. Like you get the whistling winds and you get the crashing of the waves, which when it's pitch black and dark can get you a bit nervous.
The biggest disaster was the Sam Tampa in 1947. They'll never talk about it. The crew are very quiet. They will not talk about it. And that was it was a United States Liberty ship, as they called them then, because they were all built especially for the war. And she came in, going into Port Talbot, sorry, yes. But she started drifting. And she got into trouble and went onto the rocks at Scare Point. Scare Point is all rocks. It's a very treacherous area. That's where the ship broke up in 3 pieces. And our boat went out from the pier here and they couldn't find it. The storm was so bad, the rain was so bad, everything was black. So they came back and the Coast Guards on the end of the pier shouting down to them, and William Gammon was the coxswain at the time, and they said, give him another position for the boat. So the boat went out again, and on the way, one of the crew who was on the pier shouted to William Gammon, Bill, what do you think? And Bill was like this. And we didn't know what that meant. But off they went, and that was the last time we seen them alive. They got there, and through investigations the next day, we found that they'd turned over on the rocks, and although they were self-righting, they were in shallow water, and the boat just couldn't come back up. We lost 8 crew that night, all of them, everyone. And on the post-mortem, none of them had water in their lungs. They didn't drown. They died in the fumes of the tanker's engine oil in the water, because the engine oil floats on the surface, and they breathed in, suffocated in oil. So that was the last disaster, and hopefully not another one.
Johnny was a farmer like the father before, never been to sea nor walked upon the shore. Sailors came to our town, filled him full of ale. When he awoke, the ship was in full sail. Sarah, Johnny's wife, waited his return, tried to work the farm, some money for to earn. After many weeks she couldn't pay the rent on the last bit of food. All the money it was spent. Oh Johnny, when will you come home? Your farm is in ruin, your wife she sleeps alone. Your children's clothes are ragged, there's no shoes upon their feet. They're crying with hunger, they have no food to eat. Johnny soon learned a trade while at sea, became a topmast rigger, climbing taller than any tree. Captain saw that his work it was good. He paid him with coin, Johnny saved all he could. Johnny sailed to France, Portugal and Spain, crossed the Atlantic Ocean and ended up in Maine. Johnny jumped ship as soon as he could, made himself a living by chopping the wood. Now hey Johnny, when will you come home? Your farm is in ruin, your wife she sleeps alone. Your children's clothes are ragged, there's no shoes upon their feet. They're crying with hunger, they have no food to eat. Johnny saved the money from the sea and the wood, bought a passage back to England as soon as he could. After many weeks they crossed the great big sea, leaving the ship when it docked on Bristol Quay. Johnny soon stood by his farm door, saw a man standing where he had stood before. Where are my children and wife? Johnny cried. They left the farm, you didn't return from the tide. Now hey Johnny, when will you come home? Your farm is in ruin, your wife she sleeps alone. Your children's clothes are ragged, there's no shoes upon their feet. They're crying with hunger, they have no food to eat. At last Johnny stood by his children and wife. Should have been the happiest day in all his life. But there they lay cold under the ground. Johnny shed a silent tear and was deafened by the sound. Hey Johnny, why didn't you come home? Your farm is ruined, your wife she slept alone. Your children's clothes were ragged, they had no shoes upon their feet. They all died of hunger, they had no food to eat. Johnny the farmer.
Blodeuwedd. Lleu Gyffes was the second son of Arianrod. She had no love for her son. She cast a curse upon him. You shall never marry a woman of flesh and blood from this earth. Chaiff Llew fyth wraig o deulu sydd ar y ddaear. Luckily for Lleu, his friends were learned in the act of magic. They collected the wild flowers of Wales and created the most beautiful woman in the world for him. She was called Blodeuwedd. Well, hi, I'm Helen Richards and I live locally in Abertawe in Swansea, and I'm a local Welsh teacher and Welsh culture teacher. The Mabinogion is a collection of 11 stories that have been spread into 4 different chapters, or branches, if you will. So the actual title for the Mabinogion is The 4 Branches of the Mabinogion, Pedwar Cainc y Mabinogi. These stories originated centuries ago, and they were told word of mouth and passed on from generation to generation. And about 700 years ago, they were finally written down in the Old Welsh language. And they've been translated into modern day languages, lots of other languages, English, and they're still enjoyed today, even though they originated centuries ago. So centuries ago, families would get together of an evening after having their afternoon dinner. And of course, they didn't have televisions or radios in those days. So they would get together as communities or as families around a fire, and they would listen to a storyteller. And the storyteller would know these stories off by heart and would entertain the communities and the families with these stories. Also, in the halls of the princes, the Welsh princes, centuries ago, you would have an actual storyteller, that was his job, and he was known as the cyfarwydd, the familiar, because he was familiar with all these myths. And they would go from hall to hall of these Welsh princes and entertain people after their feast in the halls of the great princes of Wales. The places where these take place, they draw on the natural surrounding areas, the mountains or certain landmarks. So that is an element of truth within the stories, where these stories actually take place in Wales. I'm personally passionate about the Mabinogion because I first heard these stories as a very young girl. My mum would tell us the stories at bedtime as nighttime stories. And her mother, my mum Gi, would have told her the stories, and her mother would have told her. So just as they originated, these stories, even in my generation, are still passed down orally through storytelling. So through my family, yes, I have a big connection to the Mabinogion legends. I grew up reading the books, and being a fluent Welsh speaker, I'm passionate about my country and my culture anyway, and I think it's important that these stories still exist. We're lucky that they do after so many centuries, and we're still passing them on now to the next generation through lovely posters, literature, and even games. So children now in English and Welsh schools can play Mabinogion games and familiarise themselves with the characters from these myths and legends. Well, I suppose with any historical literature, it's important to keep it alive and passed on to generations. It's not just Welsh culture, it's any culture that have these old myths and legends. The importance of our history is very important to pass on to the new generation. For these stories to survive this long, there's got to be something about them that keeps drawing people. Perhaps they're timeless. So the phrase and the foes that these characters got into centuries ago, maybe they're phrase and foes that we see in modern day society. Maybe not as such, not with gauntlets and sword in hand and dragons, but maybe somewhere there is some essence of truth in them.
It turned away from the blithe country, and down the other air and the blue altered sky streamed again a wonder of summer, with apples, pears and red currants. And I saw in the turning so clearly a child's forgotten mornings, when he walked with his mother through the parables of sunlight and the legends of the green chapels and the twice-told fields of Nifersea. That his tears burned my cheeks and his heart moved in mine. These were the woods, the river and sea, where a boy in the listening summertime of the dead whispered the truth of his joy to the trees and the stones and the fish in the tide. I'm Daniel Williams. I'm a Professor of English Literature here at Swansea University, with a particular expertise in the English language writers of Wales. We have a centre, CREW, the Centre for Research into the English Language and Literature of Wales. There's a Welsh literature in Welsh, taught in yr Adran Gymraeg, but then especially in the 20th century there's a body of work written in Wales in English, and that's what I'm particularly interested in, of whom of course Dylan Thomas is perhaps the most well-known example.
What do you know about Dylan Thomas? Well, I know that he's a famous poet and writer, and he's pretty amazing really. He was a wordsmith, and it wasn't of course in my generation, but in my parents' generation they would have been alive at the same time as he was.
So do you know anything about Dylan Thomas?
Absolutely nothing. Sorry, nothing.
There are so many things about Dylan that are inspirational, and that is why today in 2023 we still welcome people to this house where the man was born from different parts of the world. Now, I've welcomed people myself from 33 different countries.
Well, I mean, Dylan is interesting in all kinds of ways. Maybe the different contexts in which he wrote is interesting. So he's a Welsh writer. He emerges in the 1930s, which is the period where a lot of Welsh writing in English emerges. In fact, the idea of Welsh writing in English as a kind of field of study or a body of writing, with writers influencing one another. So Dylan's friends with people like Vernon Watkins, the Gower poet. He's friends with Idris Davies, the proletarian poet. But then there are much wider kind of resonances to Dylan's life and work as well. So he belongs in a sense to Anglophone modernism. And I think Dylan is a good example of that. He's a poet who's very interested in the materiality of words and language. And arguably that's part of his Welsh dimension as well, in that his parents were Welsh speakers. He lives in a bilingual context. In A Child's Christmas in Wales, he talks about the two-tongued sea that surrounds Swansea. So he's interested in language and multilingualism, the way in which language affects the way in which we see the world. And then beyond that again, then there's sort of world literature. And Dylan is one of the Welsh writers who kind of makes it onto that plane. So Dylan's interesting because of the work itself, but also I think the different contexts in which he had an influence and practiced his poetry and writing.
Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Though wise men at their end know dark is right, because their words had forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Good men the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight, and learned too late they grieved it on its way, do not go gentle into that good night. Grave men near death, who see with blinding sight, blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. And you, my father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light.
Well, Dylan Thomas is a central figure, right, in 20th century Welsh culture. It's an exaggeration to say that he's invisible, in that if you wander around Swansea, Dylan is palpable if you're looking for him. We have the Dylan Thomas Centre, there's the exhibition, there are Dylan Thomas quotes on the side of vans and council vans. You know, he has a presence, and anyone interested can of course go and find out. But the importance is surely that he is the Welsh writer who makes it onto the global stage. He is the Welsh writer that people around the world know.
I think we take him for granted sometimes because he lived number 5 Cwmdonkin Drive. If you go into Cwmdonkin Park, there's various little areas that are reminiscent of where he would walk and play with the boys, and there's his poems, of course, and there's his books. When you see his writing shared, you think, wow, what a talent of that man. Where did he get his inspiration from? But he was just amazing.
So for us to know him in Wales seems important in a sense. both in terms of his location within our own culture, which I think is just very interesting in itself, but also what allowed him then to take that step out, and what were the costs of that for him, what were the advantages of that for him.
I think Dylan suffered a great deal from the fact that he was a poet who was famous outside the poetry world, and there was nobody to tell him how to deal with fame.
There's stories of him going to America. He was such an innocent soul, really, naive man, and unfortunately he didn't realise that he was so exploited.
Something that happens after the Second World War in relation to the idea of art and high art and popular art, right? So you have the rise of mass culture in the early 20th century, and in the post-war period people start taking that popular culture seriously in different ways, right? So the division perhaps between a sort of academic, literary, difficult art and popular culture, things start to break down. But Dylan Thomas manages somehow to be both very difficult and commands all the attention of kind of academia at the time, while because of his readings and because of his radio work, and Under Milk Wood, perhaps the radio play in particular, he also becomes a kind of popular figure. So the blurring of high art and popular art, that has to do with the mythology of Dylan Thomas, I think, and the idea of him as some kind of, rock and roll star before rock and roll. And Dylan Thomas also fits into a certain kind of romantic idea of the bohemian artist who lived life to the full, who drank to excess, who died young. As a writer, Dylan Thomas seems to encapsulate this sort of dual process of, claiming the world while being quite conscious and creative with his particularistic roots. That relation between the global and the particular. I think he's a poet that speaks to us now because of that tension in his writing, and it's a tension we're all dealing with in different ways.
I heard the old man say, "Hey, John, Kanaka-Naka-Turaye. Today is a holiday. Hey, John, Kanaka-Naka-Turaye. Turaye. Whoa, Turaye. John, Kanaka-Naka-Turaye. We'll work tomorrow, but not today. Hey, John, Kanaka-Naka-Turaye. For today, it's a holiday. Hey, John, Kanaka-Naka-Turaye. Turaye. Whoa, Turaye. John, Kanaka-Naka-Turaye. We're bound away for Frisco Bay. Hey, John, Kanaka-Naka-Turaye. We're bound away at the break of day. Hey, John, Kanaka-Naka-Turaye.